For most of the last decade, Saudi Arabia and Turkey were rivals at the heart of Middle Eastern politics. They competed for influence, backed opposing movements, and worked against each other across multiple conflicts. Their rivalry wasn't symbolic, it was embedded in how the region functioned. Now that relationship is shifting. Saudi Arabia and Turkey are not becoming allies. What's happening instead is a strategic realignment driven by changing regional conditions. The Middle East itself is moving away from rigid alliance blocks and towards a more flexible, transactional balance of power, and both Riyadh and Ankara are adapting. For years, regional politics were organized into camps. Saudi Arabia anchored one side alongside the UAE and Egypt, focused on stability, opposition to political Islam, and tight security alignment with Western powers. Turkey anchored another, aligned with Qatar and supportive of political movements linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. These blocs clashed across Egypt, Libya, Syria, and during the Gulf crisis with Qatar. Conflicts became zero-sum, loyalty was demanded, and proxy wars hardened into long-term stalemates. But this system began to break down. Proxy wars proved costly and ineffective, alliances limited flexibility instead of enhancing it, and critically, external security guarantees, especially from the United States, became less reliable. States could no longer assume someone else would stabilize the region if escalation spiraled. Saudi Arabia's transformation under Vision 2030 is central to this change. Riyadh's leadership began prioritizing economic diversification, internal stability, and long-term growth over ideological leadership or permanent confrontation. From that perspective, endless regional rivalry stopped making sense. Saudi Arabia began de-escalating across the region, repairing ties with Qatar, opening dialogue with Iran, re-engaging Syria, and reassessing how it managed regional partnerships. This wasn't weakness, it was more strategic restraint. With that recalibration, Turkey stopped being viewed purely as a threat to be contained. Instead, Ankara was seen increasingly as a major regional power that needed to be engaged and balanced. At the same time, Saudi Arabia's relationship with the UAE massively changed. While still close, it became less automatic and more confrontational, especially over Yemen, Sudan, the Horn of Africa, and economic influence. Engaging Turkey gave Riyadh leverage and optionality, a way to avoid over-independence on any single partner. Turkey arrived at a similar conclusion from the opposite direction. Years of assertive foreign policy left Ankara diplomatically strained and economically vulnerable. Inflation, currency pressure, and declining foreign investment forced a rethink. Influence without access was proving unsustainable. Normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia helped Turkey on multiple fronts. It's reopened economic channels, signaled regional moderation, and allowed Ankara to re-enter Arab politics without abandoning strategic autonomy. For Turkey, repairing ties with Riyadh wasn't about surrendering, it was about survival and relevance in a more competitive regional environment. What makes this significant is how the relationship now functions. Saudi Arabia and Turkey still disagree on major issues. Riyadh remains deeply skeptical of political Islam. Ankara remains active in Syria and maintains its own regional ambitions. None of that has disappeared, but what has changed is prioritization. Instead of allowing disagreement to dominate the relationship, both sides are compartmentalizing them. Sensitive issues are managed quietly or sidelined when cooperation serves broader interests. States are no longer asking who is on their side, they're asking where cooperation is useful and where rivalry is worth the cost. However, this recalibration affects more than just Riyadh and Ankara. It makes the UAE heavily uncertain. Abu Dhabi has long benefited from the close alignment with Saudi Arabia. A Saudi Arabia that engages Turkey independently weakens bloc cohesion and limits Emirati leverage without breaking the relationship outright. Egypt faces a similar adjustment. Cairo has spent years trying to diplomatically isolate Turkey. A Saudi-Turkish detente makes the strategy harder and forces Egypt to adapt to a region where Turkey is no longer sidelined. Smaller Gulf states benefit most. As rigid blocs weaken, space opens for maneuvering. Flexibility becomes an asset rather than a risk. One of the indirect consequences of this shift is pressure on Iran's strategy. Iran has long benefited from fragmentation among Sunni powers. Divisions between Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Gulf states have made it easier for Tehran to expand influence through proxies. A region where Saudi Arabia and Turkey coordinate even loosely reduces those exploitable fractures. It doesn't eliminate competition, but it complicates Iran's calculations. This also changes how conflicts function. Instead of being permanent battlegrounds for rival camps, places like Syria, Iraq, and Yemen increasingly become arenas for negotiation. That doesn't guarantee peace, but it lowers the risk of uncontrollable escalation driven by alliance obligations. At a structural level, the Saudi-Turkish reset reflects a broader transformation. The Middle East is becoming multipolar. Power is dispersed, alliances are conditional, cooperation is issue-based rather than ideological. In this system, states hedge rather than commit, rivals talk, partners disagree, influence depends on adaptability, not loyalty. Saudi Arabia and Turkey aren't driving this change alone, but their recalibration is one of its clearest signals. This relationship has clear limits, trust remains thin, historical grievances are unresolved, a major crisis in Syria, Jerusalem, or the Gulf could strain ties quickly. Transactional diplomacy also carries risk. Without strong institutional frameworks, relationships depend heavily heavily on leadership decisions and strategic patience. But compared to rigid bloc politics, this model offers something valuable: maneuverability. With a shift in how regional alliances function, a defense agreement between the two countries is imminent. Turkey's defense industry already produces systems that are directly relevant to Saudi operational needs, especially in drones, artillery, air defense, and naval platforms. Drone systems like the Bayraktar TB2, Akinci, and Anka, coupled with battle-tested 5th-generation Khan fighter jets, could be bought by Saudi Arabia to bolster its heavy Americanized fleet. Combined with Turkish naval platforms, missile development, and air defense components, this gives Saudi Arabia access to a full-spectrum, adaptable defense ecosystem, which deepens military integration and makes the Saudi-Turkish relationship harder to unwind. The bottom line is, the emergence of a Saudi-Turkish relationship is not an alliance and not a reconciliation. It is a strategic adjustment to a changing regional order. Saudi Arabia gains leverage, flexibility, and independence. Turkey regains access, relevance, and maneuverability. Other regional players are forced to adapt. Most importantly, the Middle East moves further away from permanent rivalries and closer to negotiated power politics, unstable, imperfect, but no longer locked into endless confrontation. And that shift may end up being more consequential than any formal alliance ever could.